On May 15, 1994, 13-year-old Christina Marie Plante left her home in Star Valley, Arizona. It's a small town northeast of Phoenix. She was headed on foot to a stable where her horse was kept, and that was the last time anyone saw her. Her disappearance was described as suspicious, and she was considered in danger until this week. After 32 years, a break that Christina Marie Plante has been found and is alive.
She vanished walking to see her horse. 32 years later, she was alive. Somewhere right now, in a house you've probably never heard of, in a town you'd never find on a map, there is a woman living under a name that isn't hers. For 32 years, she has answered to a different identity. She has built a life, a marriage, a home, all on top of a secret buried so deep that even trained investigators, people who do this for a living, thought they already knew how her story ended. They were wrong. Because 32 years ago, she was a 13-year-old girl who walked out of her house on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and never came back. No scream. No struggle. No car speeding away. Just a girl, walking down a dirt road toward a horse she loved, and then, nothing. Silence. For 3 decades. Type below where you're watching this from, and tell us what time it is right there for you, right now. I want to know exactly where in the world you are as this story unfolds, because by the end of it, I promise you, you're going to remember exactly where you were sitting when you heard how this one actually ends. Before we go any further into this story, I need you to do one simple thing. Hit that subscribe button right now, and turn on notifications, because the Cold Case Archive brings you real, deeply researched cases like this one every single week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming in this video. Once you've done that, comment the number 13 below, because that's how old she was the day she disappeared. Let's see how many of you make it all the way to the end of this one. Now, let's go back. Back to a spring afternoon in 1994. To understand how a 13-year-old girl could vanish so completely, so silently, that it would take 3 decades to find her, you first have to understand where she disappeared from. Her name was Christina Marie Plante. Everyone who loved her called her Tina. She lived in a small mountain community called Star Valley, tucked into the pine-covered hills east of Phoenix, Arizona, near the town of Payson, inside a rugged stretch of land known as Gila County. If you've never been to Star Valley, picture this. Winding roads. Scattered homes separated by long stretches of open land and forest. Neighbors who've known each other for generations. In the early 1990s, this was a place where doors were left unlocked, where kids walked to their friends' houses unsupervised, and where nothing, ever happened. Crime, in the traditional sense, was almost non-existent. Missing person cases involving children were so rare that when Christina disappeared, the entire community was thrown into a state of disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in Star Valley. At the time, Christina wasn't living with her biological parents. She was living with her aunt and uncle, in a small home on a road called Moonlight Drive. It was her uncle, a man named Gary, who would eventually be the one to call it in, the one who realized, hours too late, that something was terribly wrong. Nobody knew it yet, but May of 1994 was about to become the beginning of one of the strangest missing person cases in Arizona history. Not because of what happened that day, but because of what didn't happen for the next 32 years. The date was the 15th of May, 1994. It was a Sunday. Warm, the way Arizona afternoons often are in the late spring. The kind of day where nothing feels dangerous. The kind of day nobody remembers as significant, until it's the last day someone was ever seen. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, Christina Marie Plante left her home on Moonlight Drive. She told the people around her exactly where she was going. Nothing secretive. Nothing suspicious. She said she was walking to a nearby stable to see a horse she cared for deeply, a routine she had done before, on a route she knew well, in a town where walking alone in broad daylight was about as ordinary as it gets. She was wearing a white t-shirt. Multicolored shorts, a pattern of red, yellow, and blue. Black tennis shoes. Those details might sound small. Almost forgettable. But they would go on to appear on missing person flyers distributed across an entire country, printed again and again for over 3 decades, in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might remember seeing a girl dressed exactly like that. She walked out the door. And she never arrived at the stable. No one saw her leave the road. No one saw a vehicle. No struggle was ever reported. No physical evidence was ever recovered along her route. There were no confirmed sightings of her after she began that walk, not that day, not the next, not for 32 years. Investigators would later use a phrase to describe this kind of disappearance, a phrase that, once you hear it, is almost impossible to shake. They said Christina had vanished without a trace. In most cold cases, that phrase is something of an exaggeration. There's usually something, a fiber, a footprint, a rumor, a partial memory from a neighbor. In Christina's case, it was not an exaggeration. It was, disturbingly, an exact description of the evidence available. Which is to say, there was none. When Christina didn't come home that evening, her uncle Gary reported her missing. What followed was, by every account, an intense and immediate search effort. Local law enforcement mobilized. Regional resources were brought in. Volunteers from the small community combed nearby roads, fields, and forested areas, looking for any sign, a shoe, a torn piece of clothing, anything. Her information was entered into national missing children databases. Flyers bearing her photograph were printed and distributed first around Star Valley, then across the wider region, then throughout the state of Arizona, and eventually, across the country. But here is the part that's crucial to understanding why this case went cold for so long. 1994 was, in investigative terms, a completely different world. There were no nationwide DNA databases the way we understand them today. There was no real-time digital communication between different law enforcement agencies. There was no internet trail, no cell phone signal, no digital footprint of any kind to trace. Investigators of that era were working almost entirely with two tools, physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. And in Christina's case, both of those tools came up almost completely empty. Star Valley's low population density meant that even during the busiest hours of the day, long stretches of road could remain completely empty, with no one around to witness anything unusual. This wasn't a case obstructed by a wall of silence from uncooperative witnesses. There simply weren't witnesses to begin with. As the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, the leads that investigators did have began to dry up entirely. There was no ransom note. No confession. No body. No confirmed direction to search in. Eventually, as happens in so many missing person cases from that era, the file was reclassified. It became what investigators call a cold case, a case that remains technically open, technically active, but with no new direction, no fresh evidence, and no timeline for resolution. For the people who loved Christina, this was its own unique kind of torment. There was no confirmation of the worst. But there was no resolution either. Just an open question that refused, year after year, to go away. What happened to Christina Marie Plante? If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment below with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story all the way through, because what you're about to hear completely changes everything you think you understand about this case. For more than 3 decades, Christina's case file sat largely untouched. Not forgotten, cold cases are rarely forgotten by the departments that hold them, but quiet. Waiting. It existed in archived reports. In old photographs slowly fading with age. In the memories of the investigators who had originally worked it, many of whom had since retired, some of whom had passed away without ever learning how the story ended. Meanwhile, the world around that file changed almost beyond recognition. Technology that didn't exist in 1994 became standard. Cold case units, dedicated specifically to reopening and re-examining decades-old files with modern tools, became a normal part of law enforcement across the country. Techniques for verifying identity, cross-referencing records between agencies, and revisiting old evidence with new analytical methods advanced dramatically. Cases that had once been considered permanently unsolvable were being revisited, and in a growing number of instances, resolved. Christina's case, however, remained one of the quiet ones. Until the spring of 2026. In April of 2026, the Gila County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff Adam Shepard, made an announcement that stunned the community of Star Valley and, soon after, the entire country. After 32 years, Christina Marie Plante had been found. And she was alive. The breakthrough came from the department's cold case unit, where a dedicated investigator named Captain Jamie Garrett had quietly been re-examining the file. Using modern investigative techniques, cross-referencing old details against new information systems, Garrett developed a lead pointing toward an adult woman living somewhere in the United States under a name that was not her own. Garrett reached out directly. The woman confirmed it. She was Christina. For a case that had sat dormant for 32 years, the resolution came together with almost no warning, no dramatic manhunt, no final confrontation. Just a phone call, and an answer that had been waiting to be found for over 3 decades. Now here is where this story takes a turn that even the investigators themselves did not see coming. For 32 years, the shadow hanging over this case was the fear of abduction. Christina's file had been classified, from the very beginning, as missing, endangered, under suspicious circumstances, a classification that reflected a very real fear that something violent had happened to her. That she had been taken. That she was, quite possibly, a victim of a crime that had simply never been solved. That was not what Captain Garrett found. By her own account, Garrett said she was genuinely stunned by what Christina told her. According to Garrett, Christina indicated that she simply had not been happy with where she was living, or who she was living with, at the time, and so, at 13 years old, she made the decision to leave. Entirely on her own. According to Chief Deputy Jim Lottie, Christina acknowledged that she had run away, and indicated that she had contact with another family member around the time of her disappearance, though she has been unwilling to go into detail about exactly who helped her, or precisely how a 13-year-old girl managed to leave the area and remain undetected for 32 years. Let that sink in for a moment. There was no abduction. No stranger in a car. No violence. No crime at all. A 13-year-old girl, unhappy in the home she was living in, made one of the most consequential decisions imaginable, to disappear entirely, and then spent the next 3 decades of her life making sure that decision stuck. So if you came into this story looking for a villain to blame, I have to be honest with you, there isn't one. This is not a story about a perpetrator, or an offender, or a criminal hiding in plain sight. It's something far stranger, and in some ways, far more unsettling. It's the story of how far a person can go, and how long a person can hide, when the only thing they are running from is their own life. Christina is now 44 years old. She is alive. She is described by authorities as being in stable health. And she is currently living somewhere within the United States, under a name that is not the one she was born with. The Gila County Sheriff's Office has made a deliberate decision not to release her current location, her new identity, or the specific details of the life she has built. This was not because of any ongoing danger or criminal concern. It was, in the department's own words, out of respect for her privacy and her well-being. Think about what that means. After 32 years of building a completely separate life, a life so convincing, so complete, that she was never once flagged, questioned, or discovered under her original identity, the final decision made by investigators was to protect that life, rather than expose it. When investigators finally sat down with Christina, she reportedly declined to go into detail about the years in between. She referred to that entire chapter of her life simply as her old life. She has not explained, in any public capacity, how she left Star Valley as a young teenager, who exactly assisted her, or how she managed to build and maintain an entirely new identity for over 3 decades without ever being caught. And importantly, investigators have made it clear that this silence does not suggest any wrongdoing. There is no indication whatsoever that Christina was involved in any criminal activity during those missing years. There is no active criminal investigation. As far as the law is concerned, this case is closed. Most missing person cases that stretch across decades follow one of 2 paths. Either they end in tragedy, the eventual discovery of remains, a forensic match that finally answers a question a family has carried for years. Or they simply never end at all, a name that stays in a database forever, a question that is never answered. Christina Marie Plante's case belongs to neither of those categories. It is one of the rarest outcomes an investigator can hope for. Not a recovery. Not a closure built on grief. A living, breathing resolution, a woman, found alive, decades after the world had quietly given up hope of ever knowing what happened to her. But even in that rare, almost miraculous outcome, this case leaves us with more questions than answers. Why was she so unhappy in that household that she felt running away at 13 was her only option? Who was the family member who helped her disappear, and did they understand the scale of what they were helping her do? How does a 13-year-old girl, with no resources, no digital footprint to hide, and no adult identity to fall back on, manage to disappear so completely that trained investigators searching across the entire country find absolutely nothing for 32 years? These are the questions this case leaves behind. And unless Christina herself decides, one day, to share more of her story, they may be questions that never get fully answered. What we do know is this. A girl walked down a quiet road in Star Valley, Arizona, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in May of 1994, and disappeared so completely that it would take 32 years, a dedicated cold case investigator, and the slow evolution of an entire field of investigative science, just to confirm that she was still alive. If this story left you as stunned as it left us, do 3 things before you go. First, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this case, and cases like it, reach more people who need to see them. Second, drop a comment below and tell us honestly, do you think Christina will ever come forward and tell the full story of those 32 missing years? Or do you think that bold life, as she called it, is going to stay buried forever? And third, if you haven't already, subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, and turn on that notification bell. Every single week, we bring you real, deeply researched cold cases just like this one, some that end in tragedy, and some, like this one, that end in something far stranger than anyone expected. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next case file.